If somebody provides a job reference about you that's untrue, and as a result you don't get the new job, can you sue? Well, the answer is, to cut to the chase, theoretically yes. In practice it's nigh on impossible, but not completely impossible. So what's brought this on? Actually, it's just somebody sent this query to Dan, and he passed it on to me because it's got a defamation element, and also we were just looking for ideas for videos, and we always like to respond to your queries. So what's the starting position is? What's the starting position? The starting position is that job references fall within what we call qualified privilege. That is to say that a statement made under circumstances of qualified privilege, you can't bring any action in relation to that unless you can show malice. There's also something called absolute privilege, where you just can't sue whatsoever. So that's things like things said in court, reports to the appropriate authorities. If somebody makes a complaint to you to the police about you, even if it's malicious, you can't actually sue. That's absolute privilege. But qualified privilege is slightly different. And that arises either where you have a duty to provide the information, or the recipient has a legitimate reason for receiving the information. And the classic example we always give actually is job references. So if something is false in a job reference, first of all, to show defamation, you have to show serious harm. But obviously missing out on a job, if you could show and say the only reason they didn't give me this job was the reference, and that could be something where they've actually said, yeah, you've got the job subject to satisfactory references, then arguably you have suffered serious harm because you've missed out on your fantastic new job. So you'd go over that hurdle. But let's say the information is false. You would have to show malice. And the thing to remember about malice is, in defamation, that means somebody made the statement knowing it wasn't true, or not really caring whether it was true or not, not doing their proper due diligence. And malice is a really hard hurdle to overcome. You might just think, a lot of people think, well, it's obvious, it must have been maliciously because it's not true and they should have known it's not true and they never liked me anyway. It's not malice in the sense that you can't just say, he's never liked me, we've never got on. That might be evidence of, the background, but that doesn't cross the hurdle. And it's probably best to give an example. And unusually, I've actually made some notes. There's a case called Thur, Thur, and Royal Free Hampstead NHS Trust. And in that case, somebody applied for a job. The person provided a reference, his ex-line manager. And it was actually quite nice. It was sort of, yeah, he was a great guy, etc., etc. However, I have to let you know that he's currently subject to disciplinary proceedings. And now, obviously, when they got that, they went, sorry, mate, you're not getting the job. Now, as it happens, the disciplinary proceedings had concluded. The person had just been given like a sort of a reprimand. And his argument was, had they have known that, that probably wouldn't have been, stopped me getting the job. So the letter contained demonstrably false information, so the guy sued. But the judges, at the court, they said, well, look, there's nothing to suggest this isn't just an honest mistake. The person who sent the letter wasn't the person responsible for the disciplinaries. And as it happened, he hadn't been updated that the matter had been dealt with. I suppose you could make the argument to say, well, he should have actually inquired. But they accepted, at the time he wrote that letter, that's what he thought the situation was. He honestly thought it was. And so that particular claim failed. Another problem with references is, in defamation, you have to plead the actual defamatory statement, especially if it's in writing, you have to quote it. If it's slander, oral defamation, although, like I say, the border between libel and slander isn't quite as, if it's written, it's libel, if it's oral, it's slander. There are some written statements. A lot of time judges take things on social media where it's a very fast-moving, like on Twitter, where people are just bashing things backwards and forwards. They said, actually, this is more akin to slander, really, because it's more about permanence and transience. So like a radio program can be defamatory, even though you're just listening to it, there's not a transcript or anything there. So it's more permanence versus transitory. But whether you're pleading libel or slander, you have to set out the words complained of, or at least if it's slander, the gist of the words complained of to your best ability. And the problem with job references, they're confidential. You have no right to see them. It's an exception both to subject data access requests, you know, like the freedom of information about yourself. Please tell me what information you hold about me. You can't do a subject access request. You can't do any sort of GDPR requests or anything like that. It's not a breach of the GDPR regulations saying, no, I'm not disclosing this to you. So how do you even find out what was said? But, you know, even if you do, like I say, it's very, very hard, because you would have to point to, first of all, and say, I definitely lost a job because of this bad reference. And if you just, they wrote and said, you know, we're not interested, sorry, we'll keep you on file, then it'd be hard to prove the causation, but for that letter, I would have definitely got the job. But even if you do, you'd have to show that the information in it was knowingly false. So, you know, that can be very, very hard, unless you could sort of point, say, here's some clear correspondence that shows somebody knew the true position and they still went ahead and wrote that letter. And they're not going to have the excuse of, well, it's a busy day, I just sort of bashed them out, or the secretary wrote it and I just signed what was put in front of me. Although there is a tendency now just for former employees just to give very bland, neutral references, because they know this sort of thing. So they will say things like, you know, we can confirm that so-and-so, you know, was employed here between the following dates, and all that sort of thing. What if somebody says something bad about you at work that gets you sacked? Can you sue for defamation? You can't sue for defamation. You have to deal with that in the employment tribunal. It's what we call the Johnson exception after a particular case involving somebody called Johnson. And they say that Parliament has made the sole tribunal, you know, the employment tribunal is the sole arbiter of any form of employment dispute. So if you are dismissed and you say that's because of, you know, what somebody said about you, you just have to bring the claim against the employer. So it's really, really hard, as you can see, because the employer will say, well, I was just acting on the information that was received and I did my due diligence and we gave you, you know, we satisfied ourselves that this information was correct. I mean, that would be an employment thing. But even if you were successful against the employer, you couldn't actually claim against the person who'd, you know, grassed you up, as it were, falsely, or made the false accusation. So that's a tricky one. However, if somebody badmouths you at work generally and you suffer ill consequences, you can go after them in those circumstances. And there's another case, which I actually made a note of. It wasn't that one. I'm sorry. Just talk among yourselves for a second. I'll pretend I was waiting for that truck to go past. Well, anyway, I can tell you about it anyway. In that particular case, somebody had made false accusations against a co-worker, actually their boss, and said, you know, that they had sexually assaulted them. And it became clear that was not true. And that all went, you know, but it actually went to court, and it was all like the guy's story kept shifting, he kept changing, he was pinned down where he was, you know, they were able to prove that certain things hadn't happened on particular dates and people weren't there and certain phone calls hadn't been made on the date. So he lost out purely because he was shifty. But that just goes to show, and the person was successful, and that was a successful defamation claim, because the loss there was people at his work took this very seriously, and although he wasn't sacked, people did shun and avoid him, because obviously it's a very serious allegation. So he got £20,000, he got sort of £15,000 damages, £5,000 aggravated damages because of the way that the person conducted the litigation by still maintaining the allegations was true even when it was demonstrably false. He also got special damages. That's where you can point to a particular loss. And he got that because the guy said, I had to avoid certain shifts and overtime shifts just not to work with this person. So yeah, that was something there. Also in disciplinary proceedings, obviously things will be said about you and it all goes out in the public domain. But that kicks in. It's a bit like you've got absolute privilege in court proceedings. Although disciplinary proceedings internally aren't, you know, it's not a proper court, so you don't have the absolute privilege there. What they say is it's an implied, if not express term of your employment contract that you will be subject to disciplinary proceedings, and you accept and consent that in the disciplinary proceedings, obviously all this has to be aired about you. So if it's a case of somebody's made accusations about you and you say they're not false and you don't want this all to be publicised, it's tough. You know, people can report on the disciplinary proceedings, and also people within the disciplinary proceedings can actually, it's just like in court, everybody can just badmouth each other off, because the idea is nobody should feel inhibited in giving their evidence just for fear of satellite litigation. So to summarise, yes, theoretically you can sue over a bad job reference, but it's really, really hard. If you lose a job because of what somebody says about you at work, then you have to deal with that in the employment tribunal, and you go after the employer. However, there are certain circumstances where if a co-worker has actually said something bad about you and that's had a negative effect at work, then that can be dealt with in the regular court and not the employment tribunal. So yeah, I think that's just about covered everything. I mean, there are some things you can bring GDPR claims. I mean, I'll pass that one back to Dan because he's a specialist on GDPR complaints. So you could try and bring a claim for misuse of private information and things like that. But again, it's going to be very difficult, because so long as the people involved can say we legitimately needed to investigate this, because we've obviously got a duty to everybody else in the workplace and to our customer base and our service users, whatever, anything like that. So long as they're acting in good faith, and they're probably covered, and proving that they're not acting in good faith is very, very, very difficult, because like I say, the test for showing malice is actually very high. The test, it's just written down as the facts are more consistent with malice than the absence of malice, which doesn't really take us any further. But showing that, generally speaking, if there's any way, it's almost like a beyond reasonable doubt thing. If there's any way that this could have been made without malice, somebody either didn't know the situation or genuinely forgot about something, or the problem is a lot of these things are just opinion. My opinion is he's not a very good worker, or she's not a very good worker. Again, opinion is a defence to a defamation claim. You would have to show it's based on facts. It could be something like, it could be something obvious. Here's a list of how many days off they've had and how many days they've been late. As a result of that, I think they're unreliable. That's pretty much a fact. But if it was something like, I've heard a lot of complaints at work about them, or people, customers have come back and said that they're not very good, or their performance is very poor, or they didn't like their attitude. As a result of that, I form the opinion that this is somebody that you wouldn't want to employ. So it all gets very, very tricky. Yeah, I hope that's answered all your questions and you can get some sense out of that. So as always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely informative, vaguely accurate. Where am I today? I'm just stood in front of a hedge because I just needed to do this really, really quickly, and this was sort of the most photogenic thing within a very short distance of where I live.